For decades, Carol Burnett was America's sweetheart, the woman who made millions laugh on live television. But behind closed doors, there was one person she despised so deeply that even mentioning his name would make her face turn cold. This wasn't a rival comedian or a network executive who wronged her. It was someone far closer. And the reason why reveals a betrayal so personal, so devastating, that it would haunt her for the rest of her life. What happened between them changed everything. Carol Burnett's variety show was a phenomenon. Every Saturday night, families gathered around their televisions to watch her perform sketches that had them on the floor laughing. She was fearless on stage, doing physical comedy, nailing impressions, transforming into characters that seemed impossible for one person to create. By the 1970s, she was more than just a comedian. She was an institution. America loved her. But Carol's life off-camera was just as important to her as her career. She was devoted to her family in a way that defined her entire identity. She had 3 children, and she poured everything into being present for them, even while managing one of the most demanding television schedules in Hollywood. Her home was supposed to be her sanctuary, the place where the pressure lifted, where she could just be mom. That sanctuary had a major flaw. It included someone she would eventually come to despise more than anyone else on earth.
Her younger brother, Jody Burnett, was always there in the background of her life. He was part of her inner circle, someone who should have been her closest ally. Carol had actually supported him financially for years. She believed in family loyalty with an almost religious intensity. In her mind, you protected your own. You stood by them no matter what. That was the Burnett way. But Jody had secrets that would eventually destroy that belief entirely. During those golden years, while Carol was at the height of her fame and influence, something darker was happening behind closed doors. Jody's behavior toward her children was crossing lines that no one should cross. The details would later emerge in Carol's own memoirs, where she described with painful honesty what her brother had done. It wasn't a one-time mistake or a moment of poor judgment. It was a pattern of abuse that had been happening right under her roof, in the place she had created to keep her children safe. When Carol finally learned the truth, something inside her shattered. This wasn't just betrayal from a stranger or even a casual acquaintance. This was betrayal from someone she had trusted completely, someone she had invited into her most private world, someone she had helped when he needed it most. The woman who made America laugh every week was now living in a nightmare she couldn't escape by changing costumes or delivering a punchline.
Carol Burnett didn't discover what was happening all at once. Terrible truths rarely announce themselves clearly. Instead, they seep out in fragments: a strange comment from a child, an unexplained fear, a behavioral shift that doesn't make sense. As a mother, Carol was perceptive. She noticed things, but even she wasn't prepared for what she would eventually piece together about her own brother. The realization didn't hit like a lightning bolt. It crept in like poison, slowly contaminating everything she thought she knew about her family and her home. When the full picture finally became clear, Carol had to confront something that shattered her most fundamental beliefs about loyalty and trust. Her brother, her own blood, had violated the sanctity of her home in the most unforgivable way possible. What made this even more complicated was that Carol was trapped in a position that many family members of abusers find themselves in. She loved her children infinitely. She also came from a generation and a family culture where you didn't air dirty laundry publicly. You didn't destroy family relationships. You handled things privately. But staying silent meant allowing the abuse to continue. Speaking up meant tearing apart the family structure she had worked so hard to maintain. The choice she had to make was impossible, and there was no right answer. Carol's career was exploding. She was in her creative prime. Her show was winning awards. She was breaking barriers for women in television at a time when that was genuinely rare and difficult. But none of that mattered anymore. The thing she cared about most, her children's safety and well-being, was in direct conflict with everything else in her life. She couldn't perform her way out of this. She couldn't make a joke that would fix it. She couldn't rewrite the script and make it have a better ending. This was real life, and real life was far more brutal than anything she had ever portrayed on stage.
The decision Carol made next would define not just her relationship with her brother, but her entire understanding of what family really meant. She chose her children. She removed Jody from her life with a finality that would never waver. But removing someone from your daily life doesn't erase the damage they've done. It doesn't heal the wounds. It just means you stop enabling them to create new ones. What Carol would discover over the following years was that cutting someone out of your life, even someone who hurt you that deeply, carries its own kind of pain, a pain that doesn't fade easily. For years, Carol kept the truth about her brother locked away. This wasn't shame, it was protection. She was protecting her children from having to relive the trauma publicly. She was protecting her career from tabloid exploitation.
She was protecting her privacy in an era before social media, when secrets could still actually remain secrets if you were careful enough and powerful enough to keep them. But secrets have weight. They press down on you every single day, invisible to everyone around you, but utterly real to the person carrying them. Carol went on television week after week, making people laugh, winning awards, becoming a cultural icon. Meanwhile, she was living with knowledge that most people couldn't even imagine bearing. She knew what her brother had done. She knew it had affected her children in ways that would take years of therapy to even begin to understand. She knew that she had made the only choice a mother could make. And she also knew that choice had cost her something irreplaceable: the ability to believe in family unconditionally. The entertainment industry had no idea what Carol was dealing with. Her colleagues saw a consummate professional, a generous scene partner, a woman who seemed to have it all figured out. What they didn't see was the private struggle, the late nights when the laughter stopped and she was alone with her thoughts, wrestling with questions that had no good answers. The real turning point came decades later, long after her show had ended, long after she had achieved everything she set out to achieve in her career. Carol made the decision to write about her life honestly.
In her memoir, published in 1986, she finally told the world what had happened. She named her brother. She described what he had done. She didn't do it for revenge or attention. She did it because she believed that silence protected abusers, and she wasn't willing to be complicit in that silence anymore. This was an extraordinarily brave decision for a woman of her generation and her stature. Speaking publicly about family abuse was still considered scandalous. It was seen as dirty laundry, as private matters that should have stayed private. But Carol understood something crucial. Her silence had a cost, and that cost was paid by her children and by other victims of abuse who never got justice because the people who could have protected them chose silence instead. When those details went public, people who thought they knew Carol Burnett suddenly realized they didn't know her at all. The woman behind the laugh was someone far more complex, far more wounded, and far more courageous than anyone had imagined. Her hatred for her brother wasn't performative, it wasn't theatrical, it was bone deep and absolute. There was a moment, a specific, terrible moment, when Carol had to face her brother directly. This wasn't a casual conversation or a family dinner that went awkward. This was the moment when she had to look him in the eye and tell him that she knew everything, that she knew what he had done,
and that he was no longer welcome in her life or anywhere near her children. The details of that confrontation have remained largely private, as Carol chose to protect her family's dignity even while exposing the truth. But what we know is this: it was definitive. There was no negotiation, no possibility of reconciliation, no pathway back to the way things had been. Carol didn't threaten to cut him off. She didn't give him chances to change or opportunities to apologize his way back into her good graces. She simply made a decision and executed it with the same precision she brought to everything else in her life. This wasn't cruelty. This was survival. For Jody Burnett, the consequences were severe. He was excised from Carol's life completely. No phone calls, no family gatherings, no possibility of rekindling a relationship with his sister. In many ways, this was a kind of social death. To be cut off by someone as prominent and beloved as Carol Burnett was to become a ghost in the circles that mattered. But here's what's important to understand. Jody never seemed to grasp the magnitude of what he had lost, or perhaps more accurately, he never seemed to understand why Carol wouldn't forgive him. There are hints in various interviews and accounts that suggest he believed Carol was being excessive,
that she should have moved past it, that family loyalty should have trumped everything else.
He didn't seem to comprehend that what he had done had forfeited his right to that loyalty. This fundamental disconnect, his inability or unwillingness to truly understand the harm he had caused, only deepened Carol's hatred. It wasn't just what he had done. It was his apparent inability to fully grasp why it mattered, why it was unforgivable, why no amount of time or apology could restore what he had broken. Carol had to live with the knowledge that the person who had violated her home, who had hurt her children, who had shattered her ability to trust family unconditionally, would never truly understand the weight of his own actions. That kind of injustice, where the perpetrator doesn't even comprehend the magnitude of the damage, creates a different kind of wound. It's the wound of being unseen, unheard, and ultimately unvalidated in your own pain. For Carol, that was perhaps the hardest part to accept. Carol Burnett could have crumbled. Many people would have. A woman at the height of her career, dealing with family trauma of that magnitude, could have simply walked away from everything. She could have retreated into depression, into anger, into silence. She had every reason to. Instead, she did something remarkable. She channeled her pain into her work. The years following the revelation about her brother saw some of Carol's most powerful performances. She brought a depth to her comedy that hadn't been there before, a rawness, an honesty, a willingness to explore darker emotional territory. She didn't make light of trauma. She didn't pretend everything was fine. Instead, she allowed her art to reflect the complexity of being human, of surviving betrayal, of learning to trust again after trust had been shattered. Her children became her anchor. She threw herself into their healing, and her own, with a determination that defined the next phase of her life. Carol became an advocate for survivors of abuse, using her platform and her voice to speak about issues that were still considered taboo. She was ahead of her time in understanding that silence perpetuates abuse, and that breaking silence, even when it's painful, even when it's public, even when it changes how people see you, is an act of courage. But surviving wasn't just about healing her children or advocating for others. It was also about rebuilding her own ability to trust. This was perhaps the most difficult task of all. Carol had believed in family loyalty with an almost religious fervor. She had believed that blood meant something, that family bonds were sacred. Her brother had shattered that belief completely. Learning to trust again meant accepting a more complicated, more nuanced understanding of what family could be. She built a chosen family around her. She surrounded herself with people, colleagues, friends, mentors, who had proven themselves trustworthy. She learned that loyalty had to be earned, not automatically granted based on DNA alone. She discovered that real family wasn't just the people you were born with.
It was the people who showed up for you, who protected you, who understood your pain without needing it explained. Over time, Carol transformed her trauma into wisdom. She didn't pretend the betrayal hadn't happened or that it didn't still hurt. Instead, she integrated it into her understanding of herself and the world. She became a woman who had survived something terrible and emerged not broken, but stronger, more compassionate, more aware of human complexity and human frailty. This didn't mean she forgave her brother. Forgiveness requires acknowledgement and remorse from the other person. It requires them to understand what they've done and to genuinely want to change. Jody Burnett never provided that. So Carol's survival wasn't about forgiveness. It was about refusing to let his actions destroy her. Jody Burnett lived the rest of his life largely outside of Carol's world, and from all available accounts, he never fully comprehended why his sister's rejection was absolute and permanent. This is perhaps one of the most tragic aspects of the entire story. Not just what happened, but the fact that the person responsible for the harm seemed incapable of truly understanding its magnitude. In various accounts and interviews over the years, there are suggestions that Jody believed Carol was being unforgiving, that she was holding a grudge beyond what was reasonable, that family bonds should have eventually overcome even serious transgressions. He didn't seem to grasp a fundamental truth that survivors of abuse understand intimately. Some betrayals break the relationship so completely that there is no repair possible. When you abuse a child in someone's home, when you violate the sanctuary that a parent has created for their children's safety, you don't just commit a crime. You destroy something sacred. You shatter the trust that holds families together. You make it impossible for that parent to ever look at you the same way again. There is no coming back from that. There is no apology grand enough, no amount of time sufficient, no circumstances that could make it right. Carol understood this. Jody apparently did not. What's particularly striking is that Carol's hatred wasn't born from vindictiveness or a desire for revenge. It was born from clarity. She saw her brother for what he was, someone who had hurt her children and who didn't seem to fully understand or accept responsibility for that hurt. And she made a decision that protected her family and honored her own moral boundaries, even though it cost her something precious, even though it meant losing a sibling. In a way, Jody's inability to understand became its own kind of insult. It suggested that he didn't truly comprehend the seriousness of his actions, that he saw them as a minor transgression that should have been swept under the rug in the name of family harmony.
For Carol, who had spent years processing the trauma, supporting her children through their healing, and rebuilding her own capacity to trust, this lack of understanding felt like a second betrayal. How do you forgive someone who doesn't believe they need forgiveness? How do you reconcile with someone who doesn't seem to grasp what they've done? These are the questions that haunt many survivors of family trauma, and Carol had to live with them for decades. Her hatred of her brother wasn't irrational or excessive. It was proportional to the violation. It was earned through his actions and cemented by his apparent inability to comprehend their consequences. It was, in many ways, the only logical response available to a mother who had chosen her children's safety and well-being above everything else, including family loyalty. Carol Burnett lived for 98 years. She lived long enough to see her children heal, to see her grandchildren grow up, to become a living legend of American entertainment. She lived long enough to be celebrated, to receive Lifetime Achievement Awards, to see her influence on comedy and television recognized by generations who came after her. But she never forgave her brother. Not in the last days of her life, not when it might have brought her peace, not even after he was gone. This wasn't stubbornness or bitterness, it was principle. Carol had learned something essential through her ordeal that most people never have to learn. Forgiveness is not always possible, and it's not always necessary.